Hello everyone, and welcome to another video blog by the Container Brothers. My name is Michael, and I'm the Senior Director of Products at Apprenda.
And I'm Eric Glusgarden, and I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer here at Apprenda.
Today, we have a guest speaker. His name is Alex Brand, and he's our lead developer on our open source efforts. And he's working on a cluster orchestration manager known as Kubernetes. And he's going to show us some cool things that Apprenda is contributing to the open source effort. If you're not aware of Kubernetes, that's one of the most successful and the most widely deployed open source cluster managers for managing containers in the enterprise. At Apprenda, we realized when we started working with that project that Kubernetes is infinitely configurable and very flexible in terms of the different options you have when you're starting up and you're deploying your clusters. A lot of our customers indicated that they had a lot of trouble understanding the different options, the different configurations that exist in Kubernetes, and also making the right choices in terms of what technology to use for compute, storage, and network. As part of our engagements with these customers, we realized that there was an opportunity for Apprenda to contribute back to the open source community and create a tool that could help customers with their first experience on Kubernetes, namely how to stand up a cluster, deploy it, and get it up and running so they can start playing with the things that are going to provide innovation in their enterprise, namely the containers that are hosting their applications. So we went out and built the Kismatic Enterprise Toolkit, which essentially is an install and configuration tool that customers can use to set up a cluster by simply providing us some basic goals and infrastructure information. And after a few commands, they'll have a cluster up and running. Alex is going to show us some of these different configuration options and walk us through the experience of setting up this cluster. Alex?
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Yeah, definitely. So as Mike mentioned, we have been working on the Kismatic Enterprise Toolkit, and I'm happy to join you guys and do a quick demo of Ket. So we usually call it Ket, just for short. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen. Quick here, and let's get started. So this is the Kismatic Enterprise Toolkit GitHub repo. It's an open source project that has been around, I think, for over a year now. We've done 23 releases, as you can see, and we have a variety of developers, and the community is fairly active. So we engage the community on Slack. As you can see, there's 410 people on the community, and this is our introduction. So the Kismatic Enterprise Toolkit has a couple of tools that allow you to build, as you mentioned, Mike, allow you to build a production-ready Kubernetes cluster. So the first thing is the Kismatic CLI, which is what you use to drive the installation. Then we have the Kismatic Inspector, which is a little tool for validating that the software, the networking configuration, and that the underlying infrastructure is ready to install Kubernetes. Then we have Kuberang, which is our smoke test. So this runs after we install the cluster. And it just verifies that the networking and the cluster itself has been properly provisioned. We also have our own RPM and dep packages. So if, for example, you want to install a cluster behind your firewall, you can do that as well. And then we have a little tool for provisioning infrastructure on public cloud. So if you want to do a demo or a development cluster, you can use that tool to quickly provision machines on your favorite cloud provider. So without further ado, I'll go over to the command line. So I've already downloaded Ket. I'll go over to the command line. We are on version 1.5.3, as you can see. And I'll just list the files here. So we have a variety of things in here, and we use Ansible under the covers to run the configuration. But the main entry point to the tool is the Kismatic binary. And the Kismatic binary is what allows you to install and manage your Kubernetes cluster. So the Kismatic installation is actually broken up into various phases. The first phase is called the plan phase. So this is where the Ket CLI is going to ask you a couple of questions, and depending on those questions, it's going to generate a plan file. And once you have your plan file, you can go ahead and provision your infrastructure according to that plan. And once you have that infrastructure, you validate that infrastructure using the validate command. And then once your validation is successful, you can go ahead and apply your plan to create your cluster. So the next thing I'll do is I've already created infrastructure, so we'll skip the slow step. I have some infrastructure running on AWS. So I use the provisioning tool to get some infrastructure going, and the provisioning tool actually creates a plan file for me, which is called the Kismatic cluster YAML file. So I'll actually show this file, and we'll walk through some of the Kismatic features that we support. So I'll just zoom in because this font is probably too small. And as you can see, we have a variety of things in here, but I'll quickly go through the most important things. So the first thing, I'll go to the bottom quick, and you'll notice that we have a couple of nodes listed on here. So each node in the cluster has its own role. So for example, in Ket, we have 5 nodes, 5 roles for the nodes. The first one is the etcd role, and this is where the etcd data store is going to be installed. So in the plan that I built, I only wanted 1, but in a typical production scenario, you usually go with 3. So you can see that I have 1 etcd node here, and I've listed the IP. Similarly, I have a master node, which is running my Kubernetes control plane, and I have 1 for that. And I've listed my machines here. And then I created 2 worker nodes, which is where the workloads I'm going to be deploying are going to be running. And then Kismatic also supports ingress nodes. So we actually go and set up your ingress controllers to get requests into your cluster. So that's the nodes. And if we go back to the top, actually, there's a variety of options here that Ket allows you to tweak. So the first one that I want to highlight is the package repository URLs and the disconnected installation flags. So in this scenario where you are behind the firewall and don't have internet access, Ket actually allows you to install a Kubernetes cluster with no access to the internet. And this is where you would toggle this flag and let us know that you're behind the firewall, that you don't have internet access. And there's a couple of things you have to do beforehand, such as downloading the packages yourself and putting it somewhere on your network, and also seeding a registry, Docker image registry, if you tell us not to do it. Once that's there, there's also some networking flags here. So for example, you can configure the pod sitter block. So if you want to give us a different network, we default to these 2. We also support updating host files. If you don't have DNS in your infrastructure, you can ask us to update host files on all your machines. If you have a proxy in your network, we can also work with a proxy. So that's where you would put that in here. We generate certificates. So one thing that Ket does is it sets up a secure cluster by default. So everything is going through HTTPS. Everything is using TLS. So that requires certificates. And this is where you configure the expiration for those certificates. As I mentioned before, we use Ansible to configure the machines. So this is where you give us the SSH information that we need to be able to access the nodes. Moving on, we also install Docker. So that's one of the building blocks that Kubernetes needs. So the container runtime, we currently support Docker, and we allow you to override a couple of Docker settings here. And then add-ons, which we introduced recently. There's a variety of add-ons that we support. most important one, I think, is the CNI. So we allow you to actually choose between different CNI providers. There's DNS, there's Heapster. We also install the dashboard, and then we also install a package manager, which in this case, we use Helm. Any questions so far?
No questions. This is absolutely, this is great. You know, one of the things that they see there is that, you know, if we seem to remember initially when CAT came out, you guys didn't have support for all those networking options. But based on customer feedback, you guys listened and went back and made some changes there. Yeah,
definitely. That was one of the biggest, I think, the biggest features we've worked on recently is the addition of different CNI providers, which, as you said, we heard from different customers that they were interested in running, for example, on Azure. So we added support for Weave. We also added support for Conti with integration with ACI, which was pretty important as well. So yeah, definitely. So without further ado, I think I can move over to the command line and actually kick an installation off.
Yeah, let's see this in action.
So as I mentioned before, the first thing we do is create the plan file, which we already went through. And the next step is to actually apply the plan. So I can go ahead and run Kismatic install apply. And this is going to run the validation, generate certificates, and then proceed with the installation. So the first thing that we do, as I mentioned before, is validate that the underlying infrastructure was set up correctly, that the machines can all talk to each other, and that all the prerequisites are installed and available on the machines.
So Alex, while this is happening, you know, Kubernetes, and that's one of the things that I think from an Apprenda point of view attracted us the most to this specific open source project for, from a container orchestration point of view, is really just a very vibrant community. There's a lot of features and releases coming out. There's a lot of requests coming in from the community, and even our customers as they use the toolkit, and a lot of times without us even knowing, you know, that's part of having an open source project. How do we keep up with, you know, new Kubernetes features? How do we keep up with new features for our toolkit as our customers are using it, and making sure that we are, you know, evolving as the community is evolving with all of those? I mean, like Michael said, when I first saw the first version of CAD, you compare that to now with even the plan file, and you see a you know, a vast difference in the capabilities that you have. So how does that process work a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So that's a great question, Eric. So in terms of keeping up with the community, we definitely try to join as many SIG calls as we can. So for example, we are fairly active in the SIG cluster lifecycle calls, although I've been slacking a little bit, but I do try to join those. We also try to join the community meetings. And in terms of Kubernetes features themselves, we definitely keep on top of the Kubernetes releases. So one thing that we try to do is once a new version of Kubernetes is released, we have a rule where we say, you know what, we won't go a week without releasing CAT. So we try to stay in sync. So we stay on top of the Kubernetes releases, and whenever there's a new release, we work on CAT immediately to get the latest and best into CAT. In terms of new features specific to CAT, we use GitHub. So our users and our community are fairly active on GitHub. They open feature requests fairly frequently. And then we also have the Slack community, which is fairly active as well. As I mentioned before, we have, I think, around 400 something people on there. And yeah, it's great. It's great. It's a great community.
Good. Thank you for that. And I'll let you go back to the installation. But one more question, because I think, you know, this is something relevant, especially when you're working with Kubernetes. So is Kismatic distribution that we're putting out of Kubernetes, or is it the open source but kind of and an opinionated production-ready version of that?
Yeah, so that's also a great question, and this is something that we've said from the beginning. Ket is not a distribution. We use pure upstream bits, so all the binaries that you're running are the original Kubernetes binaries, and all we really do is first make it easy for you to set the cluster up, and also help you with some opinions, as you mentioned. So, for example, we default to Calico because we think it's one of the best CNI plugins out there. But we also do a variety of defaults. So, for example, as I mentioned before, we secure everything on the cluster. We secure etcd. We secure the API server. We run RBAC. So there's a variety of things that, as a user, you have to configure and set up, but Ket does that for you automatically out of the box.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So maybe I get to ask a very good question as well this time. It's fantastic that you guys support Helm as part of this. I think that's a great investment by the community as well.
Yeah.
How would you compare the Ket tool to Cube ADM, which is one of the other tools that's being built by the community, and I'm sure they're also getting some traction here?
Yeah, definitely, and that's a great question. So Cube ADM is mainly concerned with standing up the Kubernetes cluster. The difference that we have when compared to Cube ADM, for example, is that we do a couple of the extra stuff that you need. So when you're building a cluster, it's not only the Kubernetes components, but you need a variety of other things. So, for example, under the cluster itself, you need a container runtime. So Cube ADM will not install a container runtime for you, whereas Ket does. Similarly, when you're setting up a cluster, you need a CNI plugin. Cube ADM does not set up a CNI plugin. That's up to you after you stand up your cluster. On our side, we do set up the CNI plugin for you as well. So there's a couple of extra things that we do on top of what Cube ADM does that I think makes us a little bit different than Cube ADM.
And obviously, if we have any customers or partners that are super interested in contributing back to Kubernetes, they can go and contribute to the Kubernetes upstream project, or they can come and contribute to Ket because it's a full open source project. They can come and implement their own features and extend this in a way that will meet their enterprise needs, and basically give back to the community and to other customers that are using Ket.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the add-on model that we've implemented is a great example of that. If any of the CNI providers want to build an integration into Ket, they can open a PR, and we're happy to take it. So yeah, definitely.
And one of the other investments that we're making as Apprenda into the community, introducing Windows Server support to Kubernetes, and essentially being able to run Windows Server containers in a single Kubernetes cluster. And I'm one of the leads of that community. We have several Apprenda employees that are contributing there, along with Microsoft, Cloudbase, and a few other companies. And we can't wait for us to be able to get that functionality into beta, so that we can have Ket come and support that as well, and expose to our customers the complicated world of Windows and Linux containers, basically in the same box.
Yeah, definitely. The Windows effort is super exciting, and I can't wait to get it into Ket. That would be awesome, definitely. So the installation has been going. I'll go back a little bit just to walk through what's been happening. So we validated that the infrastructure is ready. So as you can see, we ran what we call the cluster pre-flight checks. And that includes everything from making sure that the nodes can ping each other, that they can talk to each other, that the ports that we need are available and accessible through the network, that there's no firewall blocking those ports, and also everything, for example, prerequisites. There's a couple of binary prerequisites that we check for. And yeah, that's mainly what happens during pre-flight. Once that's done and successful, we start generating the certificates. So as I mentioned before, we secure everything. So there's a variety of certificates that we need to run the cluster. So we generate all the certificates, and once that's done, there's a kube config file that we generate so that once the installation is complete, you can point kubectl to use that kube config file and start using your cluster. Then the meat of everything starts happening. The installation begins, and the first thing that we do, if you asked us to update your host files because you don't have DNS, we do that. And then we deploy the cluster certificates that we generated. And the first thing that we need is etcd. So we stand up an etcd cluster, and in this case, we actually need 2 etcd clusters because Calico needs one as well. So we do that. We stand up 2 etcd clusters, one for Kubernetes and one for the network. Once that's done, we go ahead and install Docker. And then we start standing up all the Kubernetes components. So we stand up the kubelet, the API server, the scheduler, and the controller manager on the master nodes. Once that's done, we wait until the control plane is up and running. So as you can see here, we're retrying. We're waiting until all the pods are up and running. And then once that is done, we go ahead and configure the networking. So we chose Calico in the plan file, which is why we're installing Calico here. And as you can see, we're skipping Weave and we're skipping Contiv. If I highlight that correctly, maybe, there we go. Once that's done, we go ahead and install DNS. So that's a pretty important component in your Kubernetes cluster. And then we go ahead and install the rest of the add-ons. So Heapster, the dashboard, Helm, Ingress. And at the end, what we do is we run a smoke test to make sure that everything is up and running and everything is good. So we have a working cluster. So yeah, that's a Ket installation.
This is awesome.
Yeah, this is definitely very different. If anyone has ever tried to actually do this manually, and there's very good resources out there that will walk you through the actual installation and configuration of Kubernetes manually. Yeah. This what the demo that we just did doesn't do it justice to how much complexity there is behind the scenes. It makes it seem like it's extremely easy and not a lot of work is happening behind the scenes. But for anyone that has tried to set up Kubernetes and set it up properly, that's the most important thing, is that our customers that work with us in regards on the Kubernetes side, they use this as the setup for their production clusters to run their publicly facing or internal applications. That's something that's very important to highlight, because this is not to set up a little development environment, for Alex to play around and have a couple of containers there. This is to set up your enterprise backbone from a Kubernetes point of view. And that's
but you could use this also for development if you wanted to stand up.
Right, this will scale, and I think in the documentation has a few different options if you want to run, a small production Minikube style, so a 1-node machine for development, and it can scale. And you have also, what you're going to have is, if you do it this way, is you're going to have also consistency, right? Whether it's a 1-node cluster versus a 100-node cluster, it's going to be configured the same. Of course, it works slightly different, but it'll configure the same. So it's extremely powerful, the fact that you can take your production cluster, put it into a one laptop to get it up and running, and then go anywhere in between. I think that's very important.
Exactly. I think the important thing is, because we have many enterprise customers that are using Ket in production, we've essentially validated itself that this is a working solution that in essence automates a lot of the complexity out of standing up a Kubernetes cluster and puts it in a simple command line with the plan file that you have created. Alex, you want to show us a couple of kubectl commands before we end this?
Definitely. So I was actually going to show the dashboard. So we have a little helper command that you can use to open up the dashboard. And given that I'm using a self-sent certificate, this shows up. But I can go ahead and proceed. And AWS is a little slow. There we go. So I get my Kubernetes dashboard. So as I mentioned before, we have that add-on. So we can see all our nodes, and we have 3 nodes that are part of the Kubernetes cluster. And yeah, so this is the dashboard. I can also definitely show kubectl. So we actually package kubectl with our in our tarball. So I can use kubectl and actually point, if I remember my, I can actually go and, oops, I think it's kubeconfig. So there's nothing running. So I'll just deploy the classical deployment. I'll do busybox, or actually let's do nginx. With 2 replicas, why not? And I'll call it nginx. So we have our deployment created. And if I go back to our dashboard, which I think it's a little easier on the eyes, we can see that our nginx pods are getting created.
Excellent.
And that our deployment is there. And yeah, so the nginx pod are running. I can go ahead and access these pods. So actually what I'll do is I'll get the service. I gotta pass the kubeconfig.
Yep.
Actually, I'll do this just so that it's copied in the configuration. So I'll get the service, and what I can do is edit it to get the. Oh, I haven't exposed it yet. Let me expose it. Forgot the port. It's been a while since I've done these. I'll edit the service to get the. I'll make it a node port just because it's easier. And once we have the port, we can actually go ahead. And if I go here, we should get nginx. Boom.
Excellent. This is awesome.
Yep.
Cool. Well, Alex, this has been a phenomenal introduction into CAD. Really appreciate you coming on board and showcasing us some of the excellent work that you guys are doing in the open source community for Kubernetes. We definitely, our customers are taking advantage of this, and they love this work. And you guys keep adding those features, keep following the Kubernetes community, and I think we're gonna see great things out of your team.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me, and please check out the repo, play around with Ket. We have some interesting stuff coming down the pipeline, and definitely get involved. Either Slack, we actually have the little Slack icon here, so you can just click that and sign up. Or if you're using it and you want a new feature, definitely just feel free to open an issue and get in touch with us. So thanks again for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everyone.